If you stay until the end of this story, you'll discover why wars are often decided by something far more valuable than technology. Not bigger engines, not newer weapons, not even superior numbers. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is a veteran who refuses to follow the script. On the morning of November 9th, 1952, the skies above North Korea appeared to present a simple equation. 4 fighters hunted 2. The outcome seemed obvious before the first shot was fired. High above the gray waters near Chinnampo Harbor, 4 Yak-9 fighters descended from altitude. Their pilots had been trained for this exact moment. They held every advantage that military manuals promised would lead to victory. They were higher, they were faster, they outnumbered their targets 2-1. Far below them, 2 American aircraft crawled along the coastline. Heavy, slow, burdened with bombs and fuel. From above, they looked vulnerable, almost helpless. To the Yak pilots, it must have felt like spotting wounded prey wandering into open ground. The American planes were F4U Corsairs, aircraft whose design dated back to the darkest years of the Second World War. Their distinctive bent wings had once terrorized Japanese pilots across the Pacific. But that war was over. Nearly a decade had passed. By 1952, the world belonged to jets. The Korean War had become a proving ground for a new generation of aircraft. A machine powered by a giant propeller, while jet engines were reshaping military aviation. Looking down from above, they saw 2 old aircraft loaded with ordnance, aircraft that appeared trapped by their own mission. Heavy bombs reduced maneuverability. Low altitude eliminated escape options. Every factor pointed toward a quick kill. Deliver a short burst of cannon and machine gun fire, climb away.
The problem was that combat rarely respects predictions. Inside one of those Corsairs sat Marine Captain Jesse Fulmar. He had spent enough time in military cockpits to immediately recognize danger when he saw it. When the Yak fighters appeared overhead, diving toward him, he understood the situation in a single glance. The odds were terrible. 2 aircraft against 4. A single decision made in only a few seconds. Fulmar could have dropped his bombs and attempted to escape. Instead, he chose something far more dangerous. He chose to fight. What they were actually doing was waking up a predator that had spent nearly a decade pretending to be a workhorse. And within minutes, the skies above Chinnampo Harbor would become the scene of one of the most astonishing propeller-driven air battles of the Korean War.
To understand why the battle unfolded the way it did, you have to understand what the Yak pilots failed to see. What they did not see was the machine hidden underneath those bombs. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the Corsair generated more than 2,300 horsepower. Even years after its introduction, that engine remained a monster.
Many people imagine military technology progressing in a straight line. New automatically means better. Old automatically means obsolete. The Korean War created strange situations where aircraft from completely different generations shared the same battlefield. Jet fighters dominated headlines, but ground troops still depended on aircraft capable of lingering overhead for long periods. A flying truck carrying explosives, useful, dependable, but no longer a true fighter. The irony was that the Corsair had never forgotten what it originally was. Beneath the bomb racks remained 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. 6! Each weapon fed by hundreds of rounds. Together, they could unleash a torrent of fire capable of shredding aircraft in seconds. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks increased survivability. The radial engine, unlike many liquid-cooled designs, could absorb astonishing damage and continue running. A radial engine often kept operating despite losing cylinders. But machines alone never tell the whole story. The real advantage sitting inside those Corsairs wasn't mechanical, it was human. Among them was Captain Philip DeLong. To call him experienced barely scratches the surface. During the Second World War, DeLong had flown Corsairs over the Solomon Islands. He understood the Corsair the way a master craftsman understands a trusted tool. Not theoretically, instinctively. Because while DeLong and pilots like him had accumulated thousands of hours of experience, many communist fighter pilots had not. Training programs often focused heavily on procedures and doctrine, but real combat rarely follows instructions. Unexpected situations demand adaptation, and adaptation comes from experience.
A veteran sees opportunities that a textbook never mentions.
The four Yak pilots descending toward the Corsairs had confidence, superior position, numerical advantage, a carefully planned ambush. The problem was that it was unfair in the opposite direction from what they believed. Because while the Yak pilots saw two aircraft burdened by bombs, the men inside those Corsairs were already preparing to transform the fight into something entirely different. The attackers thought they had found victims. What they had actually found were hunters. The first Yak rolled into its attack exactly as doctrine prescribed. The Corsairs below appeared trapped. Then the shooting started. Rounds sliced through the cold November air and slammed into one of the American aircraft.
Metal cracked. The Corsair shuddered violently. The round struck DeLong's Corsair, punching through the fuselage behind the cockpit. Yet something remarkable happened. Nothing critical failed. Oil pressure remained stable. Engine temperature remained normal. The controls still responded. The aircraft kept flying.
But down below, Jesse Fulmar had already made his decision. The bombs had to go. Thousands of pounds of explosives dropped away from the Corsair's wings. The instant that weight disappeared, the aircraft changed. The Corsair suddenly felt lighter, faster, more responsive. Instead, the Corsair pitched upward, directly toward them. That single maneuver shattered the entire logic of the ambush. Targets were not supposed to charge straight into the attack, yet that was exactly what happened. Fulmar hauled back on the stick and pointed the nose toward the descending fighters.
Suddenly, the second Yak pilot found himself facing a completely different problem. Instead of diving onto a retreating aircraft, he was now heading directly toward an American fighter charging upward to meet him. The distance between them evaporated.
Meanwhile, DeLong remained in the fight. Despite the damage to his aircraft, he immediately began maneuvering. Years of experience took over. There was no panic. He broke hard into a turn, positioning himself to support Fulmar and threaten the Yak formation from another angle.
And four Yak pilots suddenly dealing with a situation they had never expected. The battle was transforming. What had started as an ambush was becoming a dogfight. As the formation began fragmenting, timing disappeared, spacing disappeared, control disappeared. Separated and confused, they become four separate targets, and somewhere inside the chaos of twisting aircraft, roaring engines, and converging gun sights, the first fatal mistake was already being made. One Yak was about to fly directly into the guns of a Corsair.
The second Yak committed to its dive before fully understanding what had happened. Instead, he found a Corsair climbing directly toward him. The closure rate between the two aircraft was terrifying. For a brief moment, both pilots could see each other clearly through their canopies. Neither man blinked, neither man turned away.
Jesse Fulmar's gun sights settled onto the approaching fighter. Keep the target centered. Wait a little longer, then fire. The 6 Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously. The Corsair shook violently as streams of .50 caliber rounds surged forward. Not individual gunshots, but a continuous tearing roar that seemed to vibrate through the entire aircraft.
The burst walked across the Yak's nose, then the cockpit, then the fuselage. The results were immediate. Fragments exploded from the Soviet-designed fighter. Splinters of plywood and metal ripped away into the slipstream. The Yak rolled sharply to one side. Its nose dropped. There was no attempt at recovery. The aircraft plunged into the harbor and disappeared into the gray water below. The first attacker was gone. Dead. The entire exchange had lasted only seconds.
While Fulmar scored the first kill, DeLong was already setting up the next. Many pilots, especially inexperienced ones, become impatient when a target appears in front of them. DeLong did the opposite. He waited. The distance continued shrinking. The Yak filled more and more of his windscreen. Still, he waited. Discipline kills. Impatience gets people killed. Finally, the moment arrived. DeLong squeezed the trigger. The Corsair's guns thundered again. This time, the burst struck near the wing root. The effect was catastrophic. The Yak did not gradually lose control. It simply came apart. The wings separated from the fuselage. The aircraft ceased functioning as an aircraft. 2 attackers destroyed. Elapsed combat time from first contact was still only a few minutes. The tactical situation had completely reversed. Most experienced pilots would have disengaged immediately. Instead, the remaining 2 Yak pilots stayed. Whatever the reason, they continued fighting. And that decision sealed their fate. Because while they were still trying to recover control of the engagement, another danger was already approaching. Unseen, unexpected. A second section of Corsairs had heard the radio calls. One of those pilots was now racing toward the harbor. The surviving Yak pilots never noticed him. And within moments, the battle over Chinnampo Harbor would transform from a difficult situation into a complete disaster.
The most dangerous threat in air combat is often not the enemy directly in front of you. It is the one you never notice. And while their attention remained fixed on Fulmar and DeLong, another Corsair was approaching from elsewhere along the coast. Captain Walter Dye had been flying with a separate section. They were watching DeLong. They were not watching their rear. Dye slipped into position unnoticed. Military reports would later describe what happened using calm, clinical language. The phrase used was complete tactical surprise. Then Dye opened fire. The burst struck from directly behind. The Yak immediately shed fragments. Metal panels, wooden sections, and engine components tore free from the aircraft, then inverted, then entered a steep dive. A ribbon of flame followed it downward.
Seconds later, it slammed into the mudflats near the coastline. 3 Yak fighters destroyed. Only 1 remained. At this point, even the last surviving pilot finally understood the scale of the disaster. Instinct took over. He turned hard and headed for the deck. Low altitude offered the only chance of escape, but Dye followed, and the Corsair possessed advantages that became increasingly dangerous in a diving chase. The aircraft was heavier. It accelerated aggressively. Its powerful engine delivered tremendous performance at low altitude. Dye tracked the target carefully. His first burst missed. Dye did not. He corrected, adjusted, fired again. This time the round struck home. The burst tore through the tail section. Critical control surfaces failed. The aircraft instantly lost the ability to maintain controlled flight. The Yak plunged toward the ground. Witnesses later described the impact as strangely lacking in drama. There was no giant explosion, no towering fireball, only a sudden eruption of dirt, shattered wood, and twisted metal. One moment, an airplane existed. The next moment, it didn't. The battle was over. 4 Yak-9 fighters destroyed, 0 Corsairs lost. From the first successful hit on DeLong's aircraft to the destruction of the final Yak, less than 10 minutes had passed. The side that should have dominated had been annihilated. DeLong's aircraft still carried the hull from the first attack. Now it was flying home. For the Marines involved, the victory was satisfying, because the battle had exposed a truth that many people had forgotten. The Corsair was never just a bomb truck. Beneath the bombs, beneath the rockets, beneath years of assumptions about obsolescence, it remained what it had always been, a fighter. And Chinnampo Harbor had just reminded everyone exactly how dangerous that fighter could still be.
It is tempting to view the fight over Chinnampo Harbor as a contest between 2 aircraft. Military historians often become fascinated by hardware. Aircraft specifications are easy to compare. Maximum speed, climb rate, turn performance, armament, armor. These numbers create the illusion of certainty. They make war appear measurable, predictable, almost mathematical.
Yet history repeatedly demonstrates the limits of that thinking. A battlefield is not a laboratory. Combat introduces variables that no chart can fully capture. Fear, fatigue, confidence, initiative, experience, judgment. All of them influence outcomes. None of them fit neatly into technical manuals.
The first critical decision belonged to Fulmar. Nobody ordered him to attack. The decision emerged entirely from his own judgment, because turning toward danger runs contrary to instinct. Every human being possesses a natural desire for survival. What separates exceptional combat aviators from ordinary ones is their ability to act against that instinct. Fulmar did exactly that. The Yak pilots faced a problem they had not prepared for. Their target refused to behave like a target. The entire engagement depended on predictable reactions. Without those reactions, the attackers found themselves improvising. Improvisation is difficult under pressure. The moment those expectations collapse, confusion spreads. That psychological shift mattered just as much as any maneuver. Combat is rarely only physical, it is mental. Imagine witnessing one wingman disappear into the sea, then another aircraft breaks apart in front of you. At some point, the fight stops feeling winnable. The surviving Yak pilots almost certainly reach that point. Meanwhile, the Marines experienced the opposite effect. Every success reinforced confidence. In warfare, confidence becomes a weapon. It accelerates decisions, encourages initiative. It was decided the moment one side adapted faster than the other. That adaptability came from culture as much as training. Marine aviation placed enormous value on individual judgment to make decisions independently when circumstances changed. The engagement over Chinnampo became a demonstration of that philosophy in action, and it helps explain why battles throughout history often produce outcomes that appear impossible when viewed only through the lens of numbers. Because numbers tell you what should happen. Human beings determine what actually happens. And over the waters of North Korea, the other part of the equation proved decisive.
Trajectory paths
Military organizations spend enormous amounts of time studying numerical advantage. The logic seems obvious. More soldiers should defeat fewer soldiers. But history contains countless moments where superior numbers failed to produce superior results. Chinnampo Harbor became one of those moments. 4 fighters against 2 should have been enough. Numbers only matter when they can be applied effectively. A force that cannot coordinate, communicate, or adapt often struggles to exploit its numerical superiority.
The moment that unity disappeared, the advantage started evaporating. Break that coordination and numbers lose value. But in moments when plans begin falling apart, that was exactly what happened to the Yak pilots. Instead of continuing down a predictable path, the fight changed direction. The Corsairs attacked. Formation timing broke down. Pilots began reacting individually rather than collectively. They became isolated participants in separate fights. This phenomenon appears across every era of warfare. A force that loses cohesion often becomes vulnerable regardless of its size. Now, imagine separating them into individual corners and forcing each to fight alone. The numerical advantage remains technically present, its practical value disappears.
And the Marines exploited it relentlessly. Fulmar attacked one aircraft, DeLong maneuvered against another, Dye entered from an entirely different direction. The battle fragmented into smaller engagements where experience mattered more than numbers. Each fragmentation reduced the attacker's ability to support one another. The process accelerated. 1 kill became 2, 2 became 3, 3 became 4. What looked impossible at the beginning suddenly appeared inevitable by the end. The ability to adapt during battle frequently matters more. The Marines adapted, the Yak pilots struggled to, and momentum can transform situations with astonishing speed. At Chinnampo, the attackers lost momentum almost immediately. The defenders seized it.
The fatal mistake was assuming the situation would remain static. Combat is never static. The side that adapts faster usually gains the advantage. Over Chinnampo Harbor, that difference lasted less than 10 minutes, yet it was enough to destroy an entire fighter formation. Victory belongs not to the side with the perfect plan. Victory belongs to the side that keeps functioning when the plan breaks.
When people hear stories like the battle over Chinnampo Harbor, they often focus on the dramatic ending. But the most valuable lesson wasn't the outcome, it was the process that created it. It was the result of thousands of small lessons accumulated over years of combat experience. Military organizations spend enormous resources trying to create expertise. They build schools, they create manuals, but there is a difference between knowledge and experience. Knowledge tells you what can happen. Experience tells you what usually happens. Knowledge explains procedures, experience explains reality. Because while technology changes, many aspects of combat remain remarkably consistent. Uncertainty remains, fear remains, confusion remains. The Marines entered the battle expecting uncertainty. When chaos arrives, the second mindset usually performs better. That difference helps explain why experienced combat units often seem unusually calm under pressure. Most importantly, they understand that problems can often become opportunities. Fulmar demonstrated exactly that. He viewed it as a changing situation. By dropping his bombs and turning into the attack, Fulmar effectively rewrote the battle. The Yak pilots expected a target. Instead, they encountered an opponent. This ability to reframe situations is one of the most powerful skills. They recognize when circumstances have changed and adjust accordingly. Others continue responding to a reality that no longer exists. The Yak pilots spent critical moments fighting the battle they expected. The Marines fought the battle that was actually happening. Even today, military academies around the world study similar cases: adaptation, initiative, decision-making under pressure. These qualities remain relevant regardless of technology. Modern fighter pilots operate aircraft that would have seemed unimaginable: advanced radar, precision weapons, yet the underlying human challenges remain surprisingly familiar. Pilots still make decisions. Pilots still face uncertainty. In reality, it is a story about people. The Corsair became famous because it was an exceptional aircraft. But aircraft do not win battles by themselves. People do. And on that November morning, the men inside those Marine fighters demonstrated exactly why experience remains one of the most valuable assets. The bombs hanging beneath their wings suggested they were ground attack pilots. But when the moment arrived, they were still fighter pilots. What happened over Chinnampo Harbor was not unique, but the underlying mistake has appeared again and again throughout military history. It is the mistake of confusing technology with capability. On paper, the logic often seems convincing. A newer machine should outperform an older one. A faster aircraft should dominate a slower aircraft. The problem is that war is not conducted on paper. It is conducted by human beings operating under stress with incomplete information inside environments that refuse to behave predictably. That reality creates surprises, and surprises often punish assumptions. They observed 2 aircraft carrying bombs. They observed low-altitude operations. They observed an aircraft design originating from the Second World War. Based on those observations, they formed an assessment. The assessment was wrong. Again and again, military forces have underestimated opponents because they focused on equipment while overlooking experience.
Technology amplifies capability. It does not replace judgment. A supposedly outdated weapon in the hands of a master can remain extraordinarily dangerous. The Corsair represented that principle perfectly. By 1952, many observers viewed it through the lens of age. The Marines flying it understood something different. They understood the airplane's strengths. Military institutions often struggle with adaptation because large organizations naturally prefer predictability. The individuals who thrive are often those willing to depart from expectations. That willingness appeared clearly in the Marine response. Nobody had briefed Fomar on the exact sequence of events that morning. Such a checklist did not exist. He solved the problem anyway. What they possessed was the ability to recognize a changing situation and act faster than their opponents. Modern militaries invest billions in advanced systems. Stealth technology, artificial intelligence, all of these developments matter, but none eliminate the need for human judgment. None eliminate the need for adaptability.
Not because they romanticize the past, but because they remind us that certain principles remain constant regardless of era. Initiative matters. They entered the fight with a correct understanding of the aircraft, but an incomplete understanding of the men flying them. The Corsair they thought they understood no longer looked like a strike aircraft. It looked exactly what it had been designed to be from the very beginning, a fighter.
When the surviving Corsairs returned to base, the battle was already becoming history. The engines cooled, the pilots climbed from their cockpits, ground crews gathered around the aircraft, inspecting damage, checking systems, and searching for evidence of what had happened over the harbor.
One Corsair immediately drew attention. DeLong's aircraft still carried the wound from the opening attack, a hole torn through the fuselage, bent metal, scarred skin, physical proof that the engagement had started exactly as the Yak pilots intended. Yet the aircraft had survived. And more than that, it had remained combat effective. And then it had flown home. For military historians, it would come to symbolize something much larger, because the opening moments of the battle favored the Yak pilots. The final result did not. After-action reports circulated through command channels. Intelligence officers examined the engagement. Many planners had quietly assumed the Corsair's air-to-air relevance was fading. Chinnampo complicated that narrative. The battle reminded everyone that capability does not disappear simply because attention shifts elsewhere. The aircraft was viewed differently. Its flexibility received greater recognition. Most importantly, planners were reminded that categorizing a weapon too narrowly can be dangerous. The Marines already understood this. To them, the Corsair was never just one thing, and if necessary, it could still hunt enemy aircraft. The pilots themselves received recognition. Decorations were awarded, yet awards only tell part of the story, because what made the engagement remarkable was not individual heroism alone. It was the demonstration of professional mastery, the ability to remain effective when circumstances change suddenly, the ability to think clearly under pressure. Years later, many aircraft from the Korean War would disappear into museums. Others would be scrapped. The men who flew them would gradually pass into history. That is the natural course of time. Yet certain stories endure because they reveal truths larger than themselves. Chinnampo became one of those stories. Small battles often reveal important lessons with unusual clarity. It exposed the danger of underestimating experience. Those lessons remain relevant long after the aircraft themselves have vanished. Every generation becomes convinced that new technology has fundamentally changed everything. Every generation eventually discovers that some realities remain stubbornly familiar. Human judgment remains important. Adaptability remains important. Experience remains important. The Marines over Chinnampo Harbor did not win because they possessed magical aircraft. They won because they understood their aircraft better. And they won because they refused to become the targets their opponents expected them to be. That lesson echoed far beyond a single morning over North Korea, and it still echoes today. In the end, the most remarkable thing about the battle over Chinnampo Harbor was not that 4 Yak fighters were destroyed, it was why they were destroyed. By every conventional measure, they began the engagement correctly, and yet they lost everything. That contradiction is what makes the story so powerful. Success is not determined solely by preparation, it is determined by adaptation. The battle became a collision between expectation and reality. Expectation said the Corsairs were vulnerable. Reality said otherwise. Reality demonstrated that old aircraft in capable hands could still be lethal. Their mistake was believing the battle would unfold according to the script. The script lasted less than a minute. After that, experience took over. Fomar did not follow the script. DeLong did not follow the script. Dai certainly did not follow the script. Instead, they responded to the battlefield in front of them. They adjusted, improvised, adapted.
And adaptation proved more powerful than numbers. A fighter designed during the Second World War had just defeated a force that should have overwhelmed it. But because combat remains a profoundly human endeavor, machines matter, weapons matter, technology matters, yet behind every machine sits a person making decisions. That is why the battle continues to resonate decades later. A story about initiative, a story about adaptability, a story about the danger of underestimating opponents simply because they appear outdated. The Yak pilots saw a relic. What they actually encountered was a veteran, and there is a difference.
Relics belong in museums. Veterans carry lessons written in experience. Those lessons can be devastating. 10 minutes later, none of them remained alive to tell their version of the story. The two Corsairs flew home. One carried battle damage. Both carried victory.
Lay the wreckage of 4 fighters that had learned a timeless lesson too late. Never judge a weapon solely by its age. Never judge an opponent solely by appearance. And never assume that a machine built for war has forgotten what it was born to do.